This is really interesting. A B-24 Liberator with a cruising speed that covered 100 yards, a football field per second. If a bomb release was delayed 20 or more seconds, it would actually hit a mile away. Could you imagine being so precise? If you were off by 20 or more seconds, your bomb would be a mile off target. This is where things got to be interesting. This was the plan. The plan was the Sherman tanks would take out German pillboxes. This is a pillbox where where the Germans were stationed. Unfortunately, the best pillboxes were on the 5 Normandy beaches. So when the troops arrived, they were looking at these pillboxes, and they were just sitting ducks. And these Germans were shooting 1,200 rounds a minute at our guys getting off the boats. Only a direct hit from a heavy naval shell could penetrate one of these pillboxes, or if we were lucky enough to fire in the hole itself. So we tried to land these tanks on the beach. The first 3 tanks drove off the landing craft tanks. All 16 of Company C's tanks sank. 27 of the 32 first tanks in the water. Could you imagine if you were looking at that and that was what was going to save you, and you watched them go into the water? It's hard to even imagine. The first 1,550 troops, there were 31 soldiers on board each of the first boats. The first wave, they were met by these pillboxes at the top of the cliff. The Rangers' worst fears were immediately realized. The enemy was active and seemingly had every foot of the beach zeroed in. They didn't know this 352nd Command was there. The second person off the first boat killed immediately. They were burdened by waterlogged uniforms and soft sand, and the Germans cut many of them down. The Germans were able to stop the first wave almost totally, spewing out 1,200 bullets a minute. This is the small landing craft that took the 31 soldiers on each boat. Problem: each early naval bombardment had set the grass on fire in the bluffs. The thick smoke had made the landmarks so you couldn't even hardly recognize the landmarks. One sailor said, "We were all seasick and headed straight into machine gun fire. This was my definition of hell." Another sailor said, "We didn't expect any trouble on the beach, and we'd been told not to run." Key leaders, the people that were supposed to tell the soldiers what to do, had been killed or wounded on the advance into Omaha. They were all seasick. They were stunned. They didn't know what to do. Any kind of movement on their part drew gunfire. Next, the 16th Infantry was to arrive with 750 men. They faced the same problems. They arrived 90 minutes late. They went to the wrong location. The infantrymen waited and struggled by crossing 200 yards of open beach. PFC John Sweeney said, "People were falling all around me. I didn't realize I was hitting the arm and leg until later. There was absolutely no cover for anyone." Rommel's scheme since 1944, every beach on which the Allies could conceivably land would be lined with hundreds of obstacles. He had put 500,000 obstacles on the beach. Large demolition teams of 1,000 men were supposed to swamp and destroy the pillboxes. The casualties were so great in the first 30 minutes that many people agree there's no historical account of that work, of how many people. The demolition teams destroyed 6 of the 16 targets. There was a feeling of the men that their losses would have been cut in half if their loads would have been cut in half. Men were stumbling everywhere. So Jarrow, his mission was to get them on Omaha Beach towards the exits. Unfortunately, the aerial bombardments had not done the job. Many of the soldiers could not recognize any bombs being dropped on Omaha at all. I can't remember which of the people earlier I told you said that it had been so important that 35 minutes before the soldiers arrived, that the bombing took place. When the soldiers arrived, they could not tell at all that the 100-pound bombs had been dropped. Private Robert Sales of the 116th Infantry said, "Machine guns were all over top of us, just like you were in a bee's nest. The captain was the first one off the boat and was hit on the ramp and fell into the water. The Germans' line of sight in the pillboxes was so dominating that no American could move anywhere without being detected or shot." The communication was terrible. Jarrow, Bradley, they didn't know what was going on. By the end of the invasion's first hour, they started to get some information. Finally, Colonel Talley, one of Jarrow's most trusted corps, was able to give Jarrow a report. He gave him no good news at all. 7:20 a.m., a conclusion was reached that any further landings on Omaha Beach would be suicidal. The British wave leader took the same advice. In the first hour, 6,000 troops landed on Omaha. By 8 a.m., a crisis was at hand. The arrival of infantry soldiers had created congestion all along the beach. Soldiers were told, "Get off the beach." At 7:30, 12 officers, including 1 general, 1 colonel, and 5 majors, arrived on the beach. The officers concluded there was no evidence of any bombardment on Omaha. They had either missed or the bombs just hadn't done anything. Arriving in one of them was General Normandy Landings, the second in command of the 29th Division, probably the oldest soldier to land at 51, next to Garrow. Well, I guess Garrow was 56. Here Coda observed the GIs just lying there. The invasion was it was going totally awry. Coda was fearless, a great leader. He came about Colonel Schneider of the Rangers and said, "Colonel, you're going to have to lead the way. We're bogged in. We've got to get these men off the goddamn beach." Schneider turned to the men and the Rangers led the way. And I'm sure you've heard several of the great, incredible, heroic stories of the Rangers opening the way on Omaha Beach. After 2 calamitous hours, the efforts of the 16th Infantry started to show the first signs of success. So this is 8:30 a.m. They were able to penetrate a barbed wire fence. It looked like that. 450 of the Rangers, under the encouragement of General Coda, headed up the bluffs. There was a house at the top of the bluffs. The Allies took it. The Nazis had put an incredible amount of time building the Atlantic Wall, and now just after 2 hours, the Americans had started to go through that wall. At 11 a.m., Jarrow did receive positive intelligence. Men are slowly advancing up towards the exit of Omaha Beach. At 10 a.m., George Taylor of the 16th rounded up every available tank and launched an assault at the exit. General Willard Wyman II, in command of the 1st Division, was sent on shore because of no communication. They didn't know what was going on. The general deduced the invasion had broken down. Even if a few small groups had penetrated towards the exits, there was too much congestion on the beach. I'll show you a picture of that. The number of vehicles, people, obstacles was too much. Wyman said, "The beach has too many vehicles. Send combat troops." 3,000 more troops were sent. Look at that. Look at that mess. It's just hard to even, it's hard to think if you arrive there, where would you even go? What would you do? Who would you listen to? Lieutenant George Gibb had an idea. It was Gibb's view that every soldier on Omaha Beach, and there were a lot of people that weren't soldiers. There were a lot of, pardon me, but my display isn't working, so I'm kind of forced to look this way, but there were a lot of people that weren't soldiers. There were engineers, there were medics, there were people that handled supplies. There were so many people. Gibbs had an idea. He said, "Everybody grab a rifle and a few grenades and let's get going." He directed fire on targets which were knocked out, and the infantry was able to advance. Shortly after noon, so that would have been 5.5 hours, the German strongpoints began to clear out. The enemy started to be driven back, and Company A began to clear to this target. So here's Omaha Beach right here. They were being able to make their first progress right here towards St. Laurent. All tanks. that made it to the beach began to move towards the exit. The tanks that made it there, how many had been lost? By mid-afternoon, 5,000 more 1st and 29th Division infantrymen headed towards the exit that had been cracked wide open. By mid-afternoon, the German defenders faced a bleak choice, either hang on or hope for reinforcements. Germans had a couple choices, surrender or die. The Americans captured St. Laurent at noon. Rommel's worst fears were realized. His Atlantic wall, it just had no depth. His communications were as bad as ours. Rommel had no idea what was going on. By late afternoon, General Wyman reported, by the way, Eisenhower was asked after the war if Rommel hadn't been visiting his wife for her birthday, would it made a difference if Rommel was there? Eisenhower said no, their communications were as bad as ours. Nobody knew what was going on. Strong pockets of German resistance still survived in Colville, which is right over here, which was a secondary objective, and also Les Moulins and Carbourg, which were in this area too. The enemy was stretched to the limit. No reinforcements were arriving. German walls built to stop had crumbled. Normally, in battle, the casualty rate in battle is usually 1 killed to 7. So casualty, I wasn't aware of this term. A casualty is not necessarily a death. So casualty is a wounded, missing, or dead. On Omaha, no one had anticipated that medical units would have to cope with such a large number of wounded people. The only alternative basically was to try to get someplace that was somewhat isolated and just start taking care of people. The longer a wound died, just like normal, the greater the chance they were going to die. Darkness finally came and the beach was anything but tranquil. During the night, the divisions were still engaged in firefights. So what are the conclusions of what happened on Omaha Beach? What was supposed to happen was the Air Force would pummel the beaches. They didn't. The Germans were few and second rate. They weren't. They had their best divisions on Omaha. Enemy beaches, obstacles would be cleared. They weren't. Landing waves would land on time. They didn't. Tanks would surprise and overwhelm everybody. Many of the tanks sank. Tanks would surprise and overwhelm defenses. The Omaha landing plan relied on 112 Sherman tanks. Many tanks never made it to the beach. Many more tanks were knocked out by the enemy. The men arriving first faced a higher casualty rate. We lost 4,700 men on Omaha out of 35,000. The situation at nightfall was troublesome, confusing, dangerous. So what was going on the other beaches? We had the American 4th Marines here at Utah. That invasion had gone pretty well. They had actually a couple days later taken the first city. We had the American 29th and the 1st Infantry on Omaha. You've heard about how bad things went there. Next, we'll talk just briefly about what happened on Gold, Juno, and Sword. Gold was invaded by the British 50th, the Canadian 7th for Juno, and surprisingly 176 French fighters joined the British 3rd on Sword Beach. So Gold Beach. Preliminary bombing started at 5:45. It was wide enough to land 2 brigades. It was decided to land the D-Day tanks directly from the beached LCDs. The first troops of the British 50th Infantry were expected to land at 7:25. Goal was to press towards Bayou. Bayou is right here on this little map. It's right down here. So they were going to go from Gold. Their goal was to get to Bayou. The bad D-Day weather seriously affected their plan. The troops hit the beach unsupported by armor, and they got bogged down by German fire. The Germans had employed 2,500 obstacles, 900 tons of steel. It was very hard to make any progress at Gold immediately. Landing craft was damaged. It took 2 days and 200 casualties to seize their objectives. But by nightfall, they had moved in about 5 miles towards Bayou. They were on the outskirts. Juno. Juno was invaded by the Canadian 7th. H hour was 7:45 there. The tide and the wind delayed the landing even further. Heavy seas meant that people who should have been in the front were behind. The later H-hour caused tide problems. Heavy losses resulted. Nearly 30% of the craft were destroyed. The fire of the German defense took the assault forces by surprise, but really progress inland was good on Juno. Sword, the landing of the 3rd Division at Sword, and the goal was to capture the important city of Caen. So the last beach we're going to talk about, their goal was to take the city Caen. Everybody thought this was a gateway to move the troops through France. Coinciding with the landing at 7:25, there was a thin beach which only allowed 1 brigade. The bad weather showed little signs of abating, and they only had a narrow strip to land on. Here's what Dune Campbell, a correspondent, said about Sword a few minutes ago. Just after 9 a.m., I landed in Hitler's Europe. I came ashore with commandos who were thrust inland. On a huge scale, the invasion is now underway. Everywhere there are thousands of men, hundreds of aircraft and ships. The channel is full of ships. Ships with gun blazing and ear-splitting bombardments. Ships smoking, a few sinking. Every minute, more men, guns, tanks, vehicles, and supplies are landing. The dead and the half-dead first prisoners are taken. Our planes were dominating the skies. I'm staying behind in a ditch with the wounded to try to gain cover from the German shells. For a moment, we thought we were going to be able to capture Caen, which was down here, but the Germans were tough. We made progress there, but we were not able to capture it. This is what it might have looked like that day. This is what it might have looked like if you were there. The statistics on gold, Juno, Sword, close to, what is that, 50, about 75,000 troops, 3,000 casualties spread between the 3 beaches. Of the German forces opposing them, 716 static German division had been virtually destroyed. The 21st Panzer Unit had taken serious losses. The landings had its problems, but it succeeded. The Germans would retreat, but Caen was still a battle. So I want to try to take you back, if I can get to my picture of the beaches, and tell you what the goals were. Do that. So at least I want to tell you what the goals of three of the beaches were. Utah, their goal was to spread westward towards Cherbourg, that important port. Omaha, their goal was to open the exits, make a pathway to get our equipment into France. And Sword, which was headed towards Caen, was looked at as a gateway through France that we had to open. It was important. By nightfall, the British and Canadians were off all of their beaches and were moving inland about 20 miles. The average penetration on the beaches was 6 miles. The chances the Germans had of pushing the invasion back into sea, which is what Rommel had hoped for, was virtually gone. It wasn't going to happen. Eisenhower to Churchill after a few days boasted, "We'll be standing on the German frontier by winter." Eisenhower's view of the first day, British, Canadian, and American troops were established along all 61 miles of the coast. Even in the middle, we'd cracked the German defenses. Caen had not been captured, but we were working on it. The German situations, they were impressive in their fighting, but the Allies were superior in every category, and we had them far outnumbered in terms of people. Hitler ordered his troops to stand and fight in Normandy. It took time, but the American forces started to ravage the German divisions. The months after the landing, the Germans had only 120. This is hard to imagine. The Germans had only 120 of 1,300 tanks left. They had lost more than 15,000 vehicles. There were vehicles sitting by the side of the road everywhere. Overwhelming air support, overwhelming artillery fire helped the Allies. What was the reply, briefly, of the German Air Force? They were only able to hit 21, and 7 British transport aircraft were lost. That's all they were able to hit. we were able to stop them from going up. The Germans had really antiquated aircraft. They were using the German Messerschmitt Flyer. They weren't able to put up much. But problems arose. Germany, what their plan was, if they were going to lose, they would try to destroy the city. This is what they tried to do in Paris, which is coming up in a few minutes. Hitler said, if we're going to lose, we destroy it. So they had tried to destroy Cherbourg, at least taking away the opportunity to use the port. And Cherbourg, we needed 780,000 tons of supplies. Cherbourg could only accept 2,000, which is nothing. Engineers had to work, they had to build ports. Imagine if you were an engineer being said, go over to France and build a port. Just do it. Weather and other problems on D-Day 15 caused the cumulative amount of supplies we needed. We were getting only 61% of the supplies we needed there. Ports had to be built. Ammunition was in short supply. All danger signals for the Allies. 4 days after D-Day, on June 10th, the Allied forces established a secure, firm place in Normandy. The assault beaches were under a continuous perimeter. Rommel's plan was to contain the landing forces to the beach, but it had failed. Hitler had underestimated us. All the Germans could try to do was defend. The Germans did not withdraw from the beaches as Hitler insisted. This slowed, and they defended every inch. This slowed our efforts in Sword Beach's attempt to get to Caen. So 4 days after we arrived, this is what our progress looked like on the beaches of Normandy. This is Caen. This is where we're trying to get to. This is Cherbourg up here, so you can see our progress. Now, 11 days after the invasion, this was our progress. So you can see we're this close to Caen. We're making our way towards Cherbourg. Montgomery and Bradley gave top priority to securing the base in Normandy. He felt comfortable that we needed a secure beachhead. By mid-June, his first aim was the Cotentin Peninsula and Cherbourg. If Cotentin remained in Germany, it would be permanent, because what could happen is the Germans would be on our left, our west, and they would move towards attacking us as we moved east. We had to get Cherbourg. Bradley wanted a swift operation. On June 18th, the Infantry Division began efforts to take Cherbourg. By June 29th, so that would be 23 days after D-Day, we liberated Cherbourg and we had this major port. Now, they destroyed part of it, but we were able to get it up and running. The biggest thing, Cherbourg had a tremendous depressing impact on the German army. It was a great port, strongly fortified. The Americans felt euphoria and relief. Bradley commented to the troops, "You men should consider yourselves lucky, and you are to be congratulated. You have ringside seats at the greatest show on earth." Montgomery had failed to take Caen. He decided the British Second Army must storm it. Caen falls on July 20th. So this major city on July 20th, that's 45 days after D-Day, falls. For nearly a month, the American First Army's advance had stalled by vicious infantry fighting. St. Lo seemed to be the most promising area where the German front could be attacked. The Allies attacked St. Lo on July 3rd and 4th. On July 11th, the battle went into the city. On July 30th, a new name enters the D-Day invasion of France. General George Patton takes command of the V troops. The Allies take St. Lo, and the road on the western side of the area began to crumble. Let me see if I can show you where St. Lo is here on the map here. I'm missing it. This is what it looked like with all the tanks and the 15,000 vehicles by the side of the road. Everywhere, there was discarded equipment. As the Allied troops passed through France, they were greeted, they were cheered, they were welcomed. France was a proud country. They couldn't believe they'd been taken over by anyone. They were thrilled we were there. July 22nd, just 45 days after D-Day, there's an attempted assassination of Hitler. This is what, okay, so this is what the interoffice memo looked like that went out to the troops. That a military clique, as Hitler calls them, should have been plotted to liquidate him. This is encouraging. Details of the attack were lacking, but it appeared that it was the army itself that tried to take out Hitler. The army had decided it must try and save something from this likely defeat. Later, it was determined that Klaus von Stauffenberg, a German army officer, had executed the attempt. 4 killed, 13 injured. He died in the attempt. The big question, was Rommel involved? By August 1944, 2 months in, the German commanders in France realized the game was up. And they realized they had to try to back up to the Seine River in France. Hitler disagreed with his chain of command and ordered all his panzer divisions to return to Normandy. The panzers arrived on August 7th, 2 months after D-Day. On August 8th, the panzers tried to move westward and tried to attack. On August 8th, the German commanders realized they had failed. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to break out now west into France. Hopefully. And one of the first areas we went to was a town called Filets. On August 16th, the British Second Army and the Canadians captured Filets. Filets is right there. On August 19th, Hitler authorized the withdrawal to the new defensive line towards the Seine River. The Filets pocket was taken completed the ruin of the German army in Normandy. The Allies took 50,000 prisoners. German casualties had exceeded 400,000. I have to check that number. Montgomery had coordinating authority over all army groups, including Patton and Bradley. This was 38 divisions. Everybody wanted Eisenhower to come to France. The German front was collapsing. Patton had become influential. He now commanded 9 of the 29 divisions. Patton was a genius. But like Montgomery, he surely had his rough edges. Many of you remember the movie when he slapped a soldier, right? The Allied goal was to take Paris. It had always been D+90. So here's Normandy right here. Here's the Seine River, which Hitler had authorized his troops to go past. This is Paris. This is where we're trying to get by September 6th, 90 days. Paris had been invaded 4 years ago. France had been taken over by Germany for 4 years. This caused shame and terror. On August 13th, the Germans began disarming Paris's 20,000 policemen. The policemen joined the resistance. Hitler said Paris will not fall into Allied hands unscathed. On August 19th, the resistance planned to rise under the leadership of a French communist. 2,000 police joined the resistance. 22,000 Germans and 50 tanks were still in Paris. On August 22nd, Eisenhower ordered Bradley to move on Paris. The Germans set the Grand Palais of Paris on fire. Eisenhower ordered that a French armored division would be the first to enter Paris. Eisenhower was such a classy guy, allowing the French to enter Paris first. On August 25th, the Germans surrendered Paris. Charles de Gaulle entered the city on August 26th to proclaim his government. Eisenhower and Bradley weren't happy about it at all. This is them triumphantly going down the Champs-Élysées when they entered France. De Gaulle prepares to enter Paris. Next came the invasion of southern France. This was called Dragoon. It was highly successful because of time. I'm not going to dwell into it. It began on August 15th. What the Germans did to make Dragoon complicated was they loaded all their hardware in the sea. The invasion of France continued. The next place the Germans were going to take over was Grenoble, which was where the Olympics were. After that, they went to a town called Montélimar, which is right there. And after that, they went to Lyon. They're moving eastward, getting closer to the Germans, to Germany. The U.S. Chief of Staff, George Marshall, urged Eisenhower to take control. Eisenhower assumed ground command at the end of August. He made the decision that we needed to let supplies catch up. This made Patton super mad. The drama that Patton caused with other leaders can't be overstated. Eisenhower finally approved Montgomery's plan to thrust into the Rhine. By September 10th, Belgium and Luxembourg, which are right here, were free, closer to Germany. Most historians view September 1st as the date Project Overlord's objectives were met. That would be D plus 87. By September, the Allies had suffered 210,000 casualties, which were killed, wounded, and missing. We had 37,000 dead, 4,700 on Omaha. 38 Allied divisions were on the continent, facing 33 divisions. German casualties were estimated to be 200,000. We also had 200,000 German prisoners. Normandy was the essential starting point on the road to liberation. Within a year of the invasion, Germany was smashed. Germany surrendered to the Allies on May 7th, 1945. Without Project Overlord, the strategic bombing, the Allied navies, the merchant marine, and the campaigns, this victory would not have been possible. This is what it looked like. This is what the battlefields look like. This is where 9,000 were buried. Probably most of you saw that today. After France, Rommel was implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. He had tried to kill Hitler. Rommel was given the choice of committing suicide in return for assurances that a reputation would remain intact. April 30th, 1945, 7 days before the surrender, Adolf Hitler burrows himself in an air raid shelter, consumes a cyanide capsule, then shoots himself with a pistol as his 1,000-year Reich collapses. Here are Eisenhower's final thoughts on D-Day. Jay, you'll have to start that for me.
Walter, this D-Day has a very special meaning for me. And I'm not referring merely to the anxieties of the day, the anxieties that were a natural part of sending in an invasion where you knew that many hundreds of boys were going to give their lives or be maimed forever. Many hundreds of boys. But my mind goes back so often to this fact. On D-Day, my own son graduated from West Point. And after his son graduated from training with his division, he came over with the 71st Division. But that was some time after. With his division, he came over with the 71st Division. But on the very day he was graduating, these men came. But on the very day he was graduating, British and our other allies, Americans, here to storm these beaches for one purpose only. Not to gain anything for ourselves, for one purpose only. Not to fulfill any ambitions that America had for conquest. Not to fulfill any but just to preserve freedom for conquest. Systems of self-government. But just to preserve freedom. Systems many thousands men in the world have died for ideals such as these. Men. And here again, in the 20th century, for the second time, Americans, and here again, along with the rest of the century, for the second time, but Americans had to come across the ocean, along with the rest of the to defend those same values. Americans had to come across. Now, my own son has been very fortunate. Those same values. He has had a very full life since. Has been very fortunate. He is a father of four lovely children that are very precious to my wife and me. Four lovely children. But these very precious young boys, so many of them, over whose graves we have been treading, looking young boys, so many of them, wondering and contemplating about their sacrifices. Look, they were cut off in their prime. Wondering and contemplating. They are about their sacrifice. They have families that grieve for them, but they never knew the great experiences of going through life like my son. The great experience I can enjoy through life like my son. Devoutly hope I can enjoy that we will never again have to see such scenes as these. I think and hope, pray, that the humanity has learned more, I think, than we had learned up to that time. That the humanity has learned more than we had learned up to that time.
Eisenhower was such a classy guy. This note was released without him knowing about it. He'd prepared a note telling everybody it was his fault if it failed. The note said, "Our landings in Cherbourg have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." Fortunately, that note never needed to be released. VE Day, as it's otherwise known, was observed by May 8th. It's so unfortunate it's not observed here any longer. Winston Churchill, how important was D-Day? The war was fought to prevent civilization from plummeting into the abyss of a new dark age. I think he's right. Or you may have heard President Trump talk about Captain Joseph Dawson this morning. "I cannot say more, for my heart forbears it, but God is my witness that the men of my company lived, fought, and died in true glory. I have found peace of heart and soul never before attained in all my life, for here I am with the bravest, fighting, grandest bunch of all that God ever breathed life into. Before it's all over, you will know that this is true and that the company is my life. God bless you, one and all." Could we give a hand to anybody? Would anybody who's been in the military please stand up? We'd like to. And we have time. I've gone a little long. We have time for a few comments, Betty. If anybody would like to say anything, raise your hand right here. Ray would like to say something.
I had the privilege of spending considerable time in Normandy with a man who spent 32 years in the German Tank Corps. And it might be of interest to you to know why on that early hours between 6:30 and 7:30, we had over 4,000 men wounded. 2,000 of them can be attributed to one man. At Widerstand Nest 62, Widerstand Nest means machine gun nest on the top of the bluff, just below Colville. He was known as the Beast of Omaha. He was responsible for killing or wounding 2,000 Americans.
Wow.
He was a runner, and it meant that his guys took messages. And when the invasion came, the lieutenant put him in the machine gun. He burned through 2 barrels, had to urinate on the 3rd one to cool it down. After the raid, after the invasion rather, he went into seclusion for 40 years. He had become very remorseful and personally painful over what he had done during the war, killing our American boys. And when Reagan came there in 1984, he was convinced to come out and acknowledge and meet the veterans that came there for that ceremony, the 40th anniversary. His name was Heinz Sokolov, and the men greeted him as a comrade and helped resolve his conscience where he was just doing his job like they were doing theirs. But Heinz Sokolov was the Beast of Omaha.
And Ray, of course, did our great class on Doolittle Ray. Let's give him a round of applause, too. Thank you, Ray. Anybody else have a comment they'd like to make about D-Day? Anybody have a comment they'd like to make? Now's your chance, this gentleman right here. Please use the mic.
Okay, I don't have a question, but I did want to just make a point. The movie called Ike, D-Day Countdown, starring Tom Selleck, believe it or not. Anyway, it's a great movie. I just watched it again last night, and it deals with a lot of this.
Good, thank you. Anybody else have a comment they want to make? Right in the back.
I'm going to throw one more, I guess, reference in that list too, which is the National World War II Museum that's down in New Orleans. If anyone hasn't been there, it's fantastic. It actually was opened in 2000 as the D-Day Museum, founded by Stephen Ambrose. But if you go on their website, they have a lot of information about World War II, including D-Day. And right now, PBS, they sponsored a documentary called Season Secure, the Battle of Lafayette, and it's on PBS right now. They co-sponsored it with the Louisiana PBS, and it's showing here locally at various tapings, so it might be something folks would be interested in taping over the next few days.
Thank you, Beth. Anybody else have a comment? Right in the back there.
The only thing I was going to say is if you ever get a chance to go to Normandy, it's a fantastic trip. We were there 5 years ago for the 70th anniversary. And the thing that's amazing to me is how receptive the French people are to what they deem the Americans have done. And as you drive the Normandy countryside, there are many, many, many homes that fly the American flag, and that's where the French people are. The other thing that's amazing is the Normandy land is beautiful. It's right on the beach, yet the French chose to leave the land exactly as it was from the attacks. And so when you visit the different beaches where the bombs landed, I mean, the divots in the ground are still there. Which is pretty amazing that this beautiful land that's probably worth millions of dollars or billions of dollars is still set aside as public land. And the cemetery that you showed is also prime land, but it's a cemetery dedicated to World War II. And the only other thing I would say is you talked about the Rangers and the cliffs. If you ever get to stand on top of those cliffs that the Rangers had to go, I don't remember how tall was it, 100 feet, 200 feet. These are straight wall cliffs that the Rangers had to go up, which was really, really important for the success of that day.
I think we've got one more up here, Betty.
Just a couple of little tidbits I've come across over the years. The stripes you always see on the planes was because the Germans had captured a lot of American planes. So they wouldn't know to paint the black and white stripes on it. It was just done the night before. So if you saw a P-51 or a P-47 or such, or P-17 that didn't have stripes, that was actually being flown by the enemy. Reason you see very few actual films of the landing is naturally there's plenty of photographers. They had plenty of time to plan for it and all, but there's a system set up that everybody turned their films in, somebody who turns into somebody for the final point. And a whole the main duffel bag of films was dropped.
Oh no.
So there's just about the only films you'll ever see, and they tend to repeat if you watch different programs, always the same, as a film shot by somebody before they were killed. A photographer was killed, he didn't get to turn his in and get it dropped in the ocean. A lot of the German prisoners of war, I never saw the number, but thousands and thousands.
It said 200,000.
But thousands and thousands of them were shipped over to America, so they wouldn't be able to escape. And I've always wondered, it seems like the tanks, the Americans and British weren't stupid. They say tanks don't sink unless you put floats on it, but it seems like with all the bullets around, especially rubber floats tend to get shot up. And I always wondered the names for the beach, is that just our name for the planning, or is that if you went there a year or two ahead of time, you'd say, oh, this is Omaha Beach, that's Utah Beach, that's just our name for the
That's a good question.
maps.
I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks.
Code names. One last comment right here. Sir. Could you speak into the mic, please? Thank you.
That it's a privilege to wear this cap. I became 18 in the same month of Normandy, D-Day, and went into the Army in March of '45. And so if I'd been a little bit older, I would have been in the war.
You're doing great. Thank you. We're gonna, we'd love for you to stay for just a few minutes, have a piece of cake, help us celebrate the great victory that we achieved. And thank you so much for coming tonight to Empower You's presentation on D-Day. Thank you. You're welcome.